think it's 2 p.m. Pakistan time and 2:30 India. So I think welcome everyone. We know that people are joining and they'll keep joining as we proceed, but I think we should proceed because we have a limited amount of time. So this is our first of our series of CBEC on the web webinars. This one is titled the COVID-19 Research Quagmire, Perspectives from the Subcontinent. Now, the subcontinent has a huge number of similarities, and we have got the virus has hit us somewhat later than the Western world. We've had some time to prepare. We've had some time to get our bearing, etc. But we also have some challenges which are unique to us. Numbers, for instance, our populations are so huge. Physical distancing looks like it's a concept that is very difficult to actually enact in our part of the world, with so many people living so close together, especially in areas of urban in urban areas, etc. Now, the most basic of public health measures of washing your hands with soap seems almost impossible in such areas where there is no soap and there is no running water. How do you do that? So that's another area that we're talking about. The pandemic has brought along with it a number of other issues that we were never actually prepared for and are actually learning on our feet, especially in the subcontinent. One of that area has been that of research. The research is extremely essential for taking forward the various measures for controlling the pandemic, for treatments, for developing vaccines, etc. So many areas that require research, but the research is coming in by it's just rolling in very, very rapidly, which is an important thing also. But with that, have also developed a lot of other ethical, social, cultural, and scientific challenges with the kind of research that is now going on. So we thought we'd design this particular webinar with perspectives from our subcontinent, from India and Pakistan, with so many similarities, and discuss some of the challenges that we are facing. So we are now, our entire panel is now with us. So I'll first start by introducing our panelists, and then very briefly, and then we'll go on to the talks. Dr. Mariam Hasan will be our first speaker. She is a physician researcher working in clinical research as an administrator at the Shaukat Khanum Memorial Cancer Hospital Research Center in Lahore. She has a master's in clinical trials and a postgraduate diploma in biomedical ethics, and has a fellowship in regulatory science and research ethics area. She will start the proceedings in a little bit with a talk on the bird's eye view of global research initiatives around COVID-19. She'll give us the broad picture of what kind of research is taking place right now around the world, and she'll have about 10 minutes to do so. We will not have any questions and answers following her talk, and we will have questions for her at the end of the 4 talks with the open discussion. The second speaker is Dr. Saima Iqbal. She's a professor of family medicine at Shifa Tamir Millat University in Islamabad. She has a postgraduate diploma and a master's in bioethics, and is currently the chairperson of the Research Ethics Committee of Pakistan's National Bioethics Committee, and she's looking after the research review that we are doing specifically for COVID. Also, of course, she's a chair for the committee, so she looks after all the research that goes on in Pakistan that goes through the committee. She'll be talking about COVID-19 research review on fast forward, unique experiences, and she'll give us the Pakistani perspective. The third speaker is Dr. Anant Bhan. He's a researcher and a bioethicist, and specializes in global health and health policy. He has a MHSC in bioethics from the University of Toronto, and is an adjunct professor at Yenepaya University in Bangalore, in India. He is immediate past president of the International Association of Bioethics. And Dr. Bhan will be talking about COVID-19 research, the Indian experience. So we will be able to have a contrast between India and Pakistan in the various areas. both Saima and Anant, of course, and Natasha to follow will have 20 minutes each for their conversations with us. And after that, we'll have 10 minutes for each person for questions and answers before we go on to the general discussion. So the last speaker for the day would be Dr. Natasha Alvarez. She is a consultant molecular pathologist based at the Azad University and Hospital Regional Lab in Lahore, Pakistan. She has a PhD in molecular biology of infectious diseases and has a PGD, postgraduate diploma, and a master's in bioethics. So Dr. Natasha, again, for 20 minutes, will be talking about COVID-19 research, hoops versus hype. After her talk, also there will be 10 minutes for specific discussion on her talk. But following this, we will have some general discussion time in which we can get everybody to have questions and answers. Now, for the participants, the request is that if you want to ask questions, and I'm hoping that you will, please go to the bottom bar of the screen. You will have a Q&A question. In the Q&A section, please ask your questions so that we can see them. Don't put the questions in the chat box. You can also raise your hands, but you can always ask questions through this. So we will start off with Mariam, who will be giving us a bird's eye view of global research initiatives around COVID-19. We'll have Mariam on the screen, and the rest of the panelists, of course, can be off the video also. They can.
Yeah, I'll just do that. Yeah.
Okay. So Mariam, over to you for your 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amir. I hope everyone can see my screen.
Not yet.
Can everyone see it now?
Not yet.
I am sharing.
Can you try unsharing and sharing again? Shall we go to plan B?
Yeah.
We can share it from here.
Do you want us to share from here, Dr. Mariam? Hello.
Okay, we lost Mariam. That's not a good sign.
Oh yeah, we've lost her.
Okay, let me find
out. Sorry about that. Dr. Mariam seems to be facing a technical glitch at her end. We're just trying to get in touch with her.
Okay, so I'm back in.
Okay. Oh, okay, super.
Yeah, you gave me a heart attack, but that's okay. I survived.
Can you turn on your video
So
also,
for
Dr.
some reason,
Mariam?
I don't know. Let me do that.
We can share it from here also, Mariam.
I think you guys should share from there because I'm sharing, but it's not showing up.
Okay, so stop sharing from there because we can see your Zoom screen, but okay, we can share from here. Yeah, you got it.
Okay, can you guys see?
I can see you digging out the presentation.
Okay, so there's some sort of lag, but I think, can you see it as yet?
I think our attendees can see. I can't see a presentation yet.
Nor can I actually, yeah.
Chat. Not the presentation yet. Okay. Dr. Mariam, can you see it now?
You can only see the folder actually. That's strange.
So Alia, should I try again?
Yeah, please try again. Yeah.
Apparently your screen. Let me do that.
Internet then.
Can I see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I think my 10 minutes are already gone. Okay, so I'll just okay. So what I'm going to do is to set the stage for the other speakers who would follow me, and to give everyone a bird's eye view of research around COVID that is going on currently. Even a bird's eye view of research is actually really hard to give because we are well into close to 7,000 published studies on COVID. And we have hardly completed the first quarter of this year yet, and thousands of studies are ongoing as well. I think it's important to understand our own context, the global context within which this research is operating. And I think this quote by an American president during the Great Depression quite aptly summarizes what we are doing right now. So taking a method, trying it, and if it fails, we admit it frankly and we try another. That's exactly how research is operating right now. The fact that our research is driven by fear and anxieties surrounding our complete lack of information related to this virus is also something that we should keep in mind. Because it's not just the public which is panicking, it's also scientists and researchers and physicians, because we don't know what to do here. So I'll essentially cover 2 points here. One is to just briefly recap for you how evidence emerges during an outbreak and the challenges that we face during an outbreak research. This is essentially going to be covered in more depth by the other speakers who would follow my talk. So I'll just give a bird's eye view of the challenges and a brief overview of the current research into prevention and management of COVID-19. We are all familiar with this pyramid of evidence hierarchy, which I think nearly everyone who has ever worked on research in research has seen. Though it's not, a foolproof pyramid, but this is what usually the research enterprise follows this pyramid. And we know that RCTs and systematic reviews of well-conducted RCTs are at the top of the pyramid, and usually case reports and case series are towards the base. The quality of evidence is higher at the top, and the amount of bias is lower at the middle. But in an epidemic situation, it's these very case reports and case series that are the originators of, because they allude us to the possibility of an outbreak situation. And it's the report of unusual pneumonias coming from Wuhan that, alerted people to the possibility of something happening. So in an outbreak, these become extremely important. But as we move along, we do firstly rely a lot on, emerging evidence from case reports and case series. We do have to move on to clinical trials because any causal evidence can only be established through those. And the thing to keep in mind is that unlike usual research, which has the luxury of time, in some sense, in a pandemic or in an epidemic situation, time is a luxury that research and researchers don't have. And then you also have a responsibility to provide treatment to patients as soon as reasonable evidence emerges. And we would also cover this aspect in the later part of our presentation. But a lot of information about the safety and efficacy of treatments is not exactly coming from hardcore clinical trials, but also from emergency use authorizations and the so-called MURI protocols, which are used for various off-label uses of medicines, investigational drugs. So the challenge of doing an outbreak research is that there are two schools of thought. The instinct of a clinician is to do something, and the instinct of a researcher is to learn. And the problem is that they cannot exist as either or approaches during an epidemic or an outbreak situation. And we have to formulate a process of learning while we are doing something. And it is this process that the world has not perfected yet. The chief tool in the learning toolkit that we have, despite its limitations, is still the RCT, because it is this model that can give us the possibility of causal evidence. But randomization becomes even more profoundly uncomfortable in an epidemic situation, because a clinician would want to treat people, even if it means giving them treatments for which justifiable evidence does not exist, because most clinicians would not feel comfortable tossing a coin, which what randomization essentially is. The issue of clinical equipoise changing rapidly is also a huge problem, because you see new evidence emerging every day, and most of the new evidence emerging every day is conflicting with what we know previously. So it's hard to establish what clinical uncertainty is. It's even harder to do that in an epidemic situation. And also RCTs are by design complex studies. So their deployments is cumbersome. And in a taxed healthcare system, which we are seeing across the globe in the COVID-19 scenario, even the most well-established healthcare systems are completely overwhelmed. The deployment of an RCT in this situation becomes even more problematic. And the need to balance rigorousness and scientific validity of our methodologies, while also ensuring that we get patients a treatment that works as quickly as possible, is a very tricky balance in an epidemic. So with this context in mind, and I've shared this context because as we start ripping apart the existing research, it's important to know that we are research often is not done in a very ideal circumstance. It's research essentially by nature is walking into uncharted territories. But in an epidemic, this becomes even more profound. And then we also have to remember that COVID-19 offers a spectrum of illness. So it's not just, it's a syndrome, and it's not a single entity that we are treating. And there's a huge variation in how patients would present. And many and most patients are asymptomatic and mild and don't essentially even need treatment. So research into management of COVID-19 is essentially right now, and I'm only focusing on management and essentially treatment and preventive aspects of COVID-19, because there are many aspects of epidemic research that are going on, but our focus essentially is going to be on this aspect today. How to manage COVID-19 and perhaps a little bit about prevention via use of vaccines. So, and I think within the management of COVID-19, I will share with you the status of current research for various repurposed drugs that are already approved, but not approved for management of COVID-19, that are currently being explored for their possible role in treatment of this condition. Some of the investigational drugs that have been studied in similar viruses from the same corona family. Some immune-based therapies, including use of convalescent plasma, as well as vaccines. Right now, there are no recommended treatments for pre or post-exposure prophylaxis, or no recommended drug therapies for treatment of asymptomatic patients. So the therapies that we would be seeing in the subsequent slides have essentially been tested in patients who have presented with at least moderate to severe disease, and in most cases with critical illnesses. A look at the clinicaltrials.gov shows us that currently there are more than 1,400 studies that are registered on this platform. And of these, more than half of these are currently recruiting. Some have been closed or completed or prematurely terminated or not yet started. And of these, at least 300 clinical trials in various phases have been registered. So this is just to give you an idea of the kind of work that is happening globally around COVID. If we start, if I try and give a little bit of summary of the star drugs that we currently see, I think the drugs that have emerged as possible targets for therapy or treatment of COVID are chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, their combination with azithromycin and some other drugs, remdesivir, which is the current possible next blockbuster on the block, as well as the use of convalescent plasma. So these are the drugs that I have focused on today. There are some other antiviral therapies that have shown some effect, but most of the existing research has not really shown a significant benefit of all these therapies. So, so chloroquine, we all know, is something that is already approved for malaria and extraintestinal amoebiasis, and some cardiac toxicities are a concern, especially when this is used in high doses. Initial evidence did emerge from case series that were firstly reported out of China. But now we do have some clinical trials that have been reported. In most of these clinical trials, the limitations that we have seen is either related to the patient population or the sample size of these particular studies. This is a theme that you would see across most of the research that is currently coming out. The issue of finding a representative population but also provides a comprehensive overview of the population that the world currently has. The issue of patients with chronic comorbidities and other confounders that may have an effect is also something that we have seen in most chloroquine studies so far. The verdict so far on chloroquine is that there is some concern for, in fact, increased toxicity and even increased mortality when used with azithromycin. At least no significant benefit has been observed in studies, but most of these did not have adequate sample size to draw a conclusive evidence. We have seen similar results with hydroxychloroquine studies, retrospective observational cohorts from the United States veteran hospitals, which essentially had an all-male population, showed no beneficial effect and a possible association with increased mortality. But again, some residual confounding may have affected the study results. So the verdict is still not conclusive. And then a recent randomized controlled trial that compared hydroxychloroquine with standard of care, though it did have limitations such as unclear reporting on what constituted standard of care and what concomitant medications were given to these patients. The primary endpoint of that particular trial was viral clearance, and there was no difference in viral clearance between hydroxychloroquine and the standard of care arm. And we have seen similar, somewhat similar limitation in other previous case series, which initially alluded to some benefit of these drugs and led to development of clinical trials. Another recent study that has come up, which everyone was expecting to be successful and was not, was an RCT that explored treatment of lopinavir and rotenavir and versus standard of care. Again, the study was underpowered to show small effects. However, it did, the primary endpoint of that particular trial was also not reached. So it failed to find virologic or clinical benefit of these drugs over standard of care. However, we are increasingly realizing that we have to understand that at best, most of these drugs would have a modest effect, and we are unlikely to see a remarkable benefit with these drugs. So it's important that these studies are adequately powered to detect small differences in treatments as well. And most of the reported studies are also alluding to the fact that the selection of patient population and the control for confounders is also very important. In the last
Mariam, you have 1 more minute.
Okay. So remdesivir again is something we are all familiar with, the recent NIH trial that has been considered to be successful. And this was the first randomized double-blind trial which had shown some benefit, but this particular trial has only reported a preliminary analysis. And a similar trial from China has actually shown no difference in time to clinical improvement. Convalescent plasma, again, is something we have only seen, retrospective cohort studies and case series, and we are yet to see conclusive evidence from randomized controlled clinical trials. I'll end a little bit about what is the current status on vaccines for COVID-19. While there are many preclinical and early phase researches that are going on around the world, when we see clinical trials, currently there are at least 2 vaccine candidates that have moved on to the phase 2-3 phase. These are being conducted by academic organizations in Australia, Netherlands, and US, and some biotechnology companies in US as well as in China, along with some governmental organizations. These vaccines are expected to move very soon to a phase 3 phase. And it is expected that we would start seeing reports from these trials very soon in published literature, which would take us to the realm of manufacturing and distribution of these drugs. But this is a discussion I leave for the rest of the participants. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Mariam. We had given you very little time and a large agenda. And
I think Dr. Amir is muted.
okay, so now you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you very much. We've given you a large agenda in a very short time, but what we're trying to do now is we'll move on to the next series of talks, but there are several questions pertaining to your talk, which we'll come back to you at the end of the session. So I think we should move on to the situation in Pakistan, with Saima talking about focusing on Pakistan. And you will notice that some of the drugs, the star performers that Mariam was talking about, are actually performing in Pakistan in various clinical trials also. So over to you, Saima Parvez Iqbal, COVID-19 research on fast forward, unique experiences from Pakistan.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Amir. Can I share my screen?
Yes, please do.
All right, is my,
yeah.
Is it? All right, so thank you very much, Dr. Amir. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon to all participants of this webinar. As chairperson of the Research Ethics Committee of the National Bioethics Committee of Pakistan, I appreciate this opportunity for us to discuss our challenges and experiences while reviewing COVID-related research proposals. So I will start my talk with a brief overview about the NBC and the NBC REC, how we adapted and how we responded to the corona pandemic, the spectrum of proposals that we have seen in the last 2 months, the challenges that we have faced with these proposals, and I will sum up in the end about the lessons that we have learned along the way. So the National Bioethics Committee is a Gazette notified advisory body on bioethics. We came into being in 2004, and our function was to promote and facilitate healthcare ethics and research ethics. We have two subcommittees, the HC and the Research Ethics Committee, and which I'm chairing, the REC. So you can see here that we are a mix of people. We come from different organizations. We represent different organizations within the country. We have ex officio members and we have elected members. As I mentioned, there are two subcommittees, the Healthcare Ethics Committee and the Research Ethics Committee. And from here on, I'll be talking about how we have been functioning. So our REC members, you can see we are a mix of physicians, surgeons, scientists, researchers, academicians, and all of us have a common background of training in research ethics. So we review human subject researches done all over Pakistan, specifically those projects which are foreign funded or funded by the government, or any research which is done multi-province. And by that we mean at least 2 provinces of the country. Also, any clinical trial being registered even in a single center of Pakistan comes under our ambit. And the reason is because human subject research comes under the domain of the federal ministry. So the NBC has quarterly meetings, and our last meeting was held in February 2020, chaired by Dr. Zafar Mirza. And by that time, we did not have any corona cases within Pakistan, but we did discuss the possibility of an emergency and how we would react to it. So the REC, as you can see by this slide, we do have experience with reviewing proposals. And these are the proposals that we have been reviewing in normal times. So before COVID, the process of reviewing is that the principal investigator emails his proposal to the NBC Secretariat after fulfilling the requirements. And the requirements include local IRB approvals, any MOUs, or any material transfer agreements, budgets, and so on. So once the proposal is received by the REC chairperson, which is myself, I then forward it to the committee members and give them a 4-week deadline. And then after that, I receive the discussion and comments individually through mail. Then I have to review and compile and synthesize a final report, which is then sent back to the PI. So on average, from proposal submission to proposal approval, it takes about 6 weeks. And during quarterly meetings, if there are pending proposals, we do tend to discuss projects face-to-face as well. But once COVID started, towards when we reported our first case in the end of February, this notice came up, and so the Higher Education Commission was funding proposals related to COVID research. So the REC was aware that we would be receiving an onslaught of proposals for review. So the first thing that we did was we developed a WhatsApp group. Now this is interesting because we've been working together for several years. This need was never there, but since we wanted to communicate rapidly with one another, this is how the first thing that we developed our own group and started communicating. So we developed our revised our TORs for rapid turnaround review. This credit goes to Dr. Faiza, who is our coordinator of the NBC. And this document was prepared within about a week, 10 days time. And the guidance for this document was taken from the WHO protocol for SOP procedures for National Research Ethics Committee. So we had developed our TORs for responding to COVID proposals. And this is also available on the NBC website. So this pictorial shows the process now again. So whereas we were reviewing proposals with 1 month and 6-week deadlines, now, once we receive the proposal, we review it within 24 hours and then have online discussions through Zoom, and then communicate our decision within 72 hours back to the PI. So we've been last 2 months, frequent Zoom meetings, usually in the evenings, and depending upon the discussion that we have, it can last up to 2 hours. And this is what a typical REC Zoom meeting looks like, courtesy Dr. Amir for the photograph. So the spectrum of proposals that we have received up till now. Now we've received a good mix. We've received observational studies and interventional studies. So among the observational studies, these are some of the ones studying severe acute respiratory tract infection patterns due to COVID among our patients, assessment of social and economic impact of smokers due to COVID, and psychosocial impact of COVID on patients suffering from mental illnesses. Now, although these are observational, one of the things that we do ask the PI is to how the social value that these researchers will give, and how they will communicate these results to local authorities that may be using this information. You can see we've seen a good number of interventional studies. What Dr. Mariam has shown us already. So we are seeing RCTs related to hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, use of antivirals, azithromycin. We have seen MURI studies like convalescent plasma use in severe COVID cases. Then the WHO Solidarity Trial, we've also reviewed that, which is an example of a platform trial. Then evaluating the use of IV immunoglobulins for COVID patients. We've even received a proposal on the use of traditional Chinese medicine for treating mild COVID. And then we've had some other drugs being used like aspirin, losartan, and simvastatin. And then the latest we've reviewed is tocilizumab used to treat cytokine release syndrome. So the challenges as that we as an REC are facing. So as I mentioned previously, for observational studies, because these proposals have been hastily written, social value has not been mentioned, a lot of missing information about how, who are the stakeholders, who are the people involved, how will data collectors be collecting information. So we've been focusing a lot on if these studies are needed, and if they are needed, then how will it benefit our society? We realized that as an REC, very few of us, hardly any of us were experienced enough to review pandemic or disaster research. So we realized that we need to get more people on board to help us in this endeavor. So we co-opted members from our own contacts who we thought would be able to help us. And therefore we developed a pool of subject specialists. And this pool now consists of pulmonologists, ID specialists, intensivists, anesthetists, people from nursing, academics, pharmacologists, molecular biologists, and so on. So they've been kind enough. We sent an official email to them asking them that if we need your input, kindly do so in the shortest amount of time as possible, and they've been very kind. Also, as I said, hastily made proposals, unclear methodology, issues with isolation. Now, some researchers have mentioned that they want to do follow-up studies and they want to follow up their patients. So the questions, the practical questions that an REC would ask, that how would you expect someone who's in quarantine or in isolation to come for follow-up? So do you expect them to break their isolation? So these were the questions that we as an REC would ask. I've added that, we've been going back and forth with the PI on various studies, and the ×3 I've mentioned that on average, each study, if it's not well documented, not well written, then we have ended up reviewing some studies at least 3 times with back and forth emails. And we've also had to even schedule a Zoom call with the PI for clarifications. So another aspect that we do tend to face, and the REC really scrutinizes very carefully, are the informed consent form. And there is always an element of therapeutic misconception, which is when the research subject is under the false impression that he is being involved for a treatment rather than a research. So we have been very strict in that, and we have emailed back to the PI that please review your informed consent form, not to give a false impression. This is one example that I can give you of a major challenge that we have faced, and we are still in the process of facing. This has been published on social media, on television, and for those of you who are unable to understand Urdu, I've translated it verbatim. So it comes out that good news for corona patients, treatment possible with plasma therapy. And we have had researchers coming on to social media, coming on to television, advertising that they are going to do this trial, but somehow it gets lost. The meaning that is taken is that it's giving more hope, and probably Dr. Natasha will be covering that later on in her presentation. So again, the question mark I've put here is because do we have any code of ethics for researchers interacting with media in Pakistan? No. And we hope that researchers would take from this that please don't be premature in interacting, because it gives a false impression. Another thing that we have faced is lack of coordination with local IRBs. Now, usually in the 6 weeks approval process before COVID, we would approve projects only once we've received local IRB approvals. But in one instance, what happened, because of there is, people are pressed for time, the PI sends his IRB proposal to the local IRB as well as to the NBC REC. And at one point in time, we had actually approved a certain proposal, and the local IRB was still reviewing it. And what happened was there was a confusion that because the NBC has approved this study, so the local IRB felt that their decision was being overridden. Which is entirely untrue, because that was not the case. We have specified in our approval letters that local IRB approval must be submitted later on. Once it is there, it needs to be submitted to the NBC REC as well. So what we did was we then looked at our own SOPs, and we started numbering the version received by us and which version that we had approved of the proposal, and we've developed a log for that. Then we as an REC always want to ensure patient safety, especially on vulnerable people, those who are sick. We do ask about details of the DSMB, how independent it is, and their standard operating procedures. Interestingly, another issue that we are facing is regarding use of non-allopathic medicines. I've mentioned that we've received a proposal regarding testing traditional Chinese medicine for COVID, and we were interestingly, there was no literature available. If there was, it was in the Chinese language, and there were no phase 1 or phase 2 trials which prove that this molecule was safe and effective. And therefore, we withheld our decision on, and we are still withholding it. We've sent a query to the Clinical Trials Committee of DRAP to see what their rules are. Do we have any, anything in our rule book which says that we can test non-allopathic medicines? So again, they've replied back and they've told us that there is nothing in there. They're only there to test allopathic medications. So this, I see that we will be meeting again to discuss this further, because the issue has not been resolved as yet. So I will end my presentation by just summarizing our own experiences, what we've learned. We've learned that we've definitely increased our knowledge and skills in reviewing pandemic-related research and disaster research. We are now comfortable with the terms MURI, rapidly adaptive study designs, and platform trials. We've identified shortcomings within our own procedures, so that we give clearer instructions and approval letters from here on. We have been timely and effectively communicating with stakeholders, which includes PIs as well as members from the Clinical Trials Committee in DRAP. We've learned to manage our time, and I think we have become more effective. So if anything, we are now reviewing research more effectively, more vigorously. We have constant discussions and reflections through our WhatsApp, emails, and Zoom meetings. And so the learning for us is never ending. And the debate is still going on. So I will thank you, Dr. Faiz and Dr. Amir. And yeah, any questions I will be happy to take.
So for a good overview of our experience in Pakistan dealing with COVID rapid research. So you pointed out very, very important areas of challenge that we have actually faced, and very areas, and as we've kind of hit the ground running, we have prepared our terms of reference for rapid review before the first COVID review that we did. So we were prepared for that. And we enhanced our capacity by co-opting so many diverse group of members. So that was an excellent thing. The other thing that we have done is that we've realized that we are just one committee that reviews. So there's another committee, the Clinical Research Committee of the Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan, which has considerably more teeth than the NBC, and that also reviews. And we've tried to liaise between the two of us. As you said, the last query that we sent off to them was about this Chinese drug. We don't have any safety and efficacy data from Pakistan or from any English language literature. And yet we are now looking at a study that is treating people, using it to quote unquote treat people as a research project. So where do we stand as a committee and from the national point of view? And there was no policy up till now. So we've actually pointed out a lot of things. And we'll of course take a few questions right now with specifically for your topic. But I'd like to start by asking you. So you showed one of the slides of a researcher putting up or somebody putting up a slide of this major height with one particular mode of treatment, alleged treatment. I mean, we're still researching that. Now, what is the role of the Research Ethics Committee or regulatory bodies in having some sort of a code of conduct for researchers? We see every day on media, in the television programs, etc., in which the researchers are brought on board, and of course these are researchers; they're not performers in front of television, but they're brought on, and then they're pounded with questions about when is it going to happen, how many people, when will you have the drug ready, when will you have the vaccine ready, and the very senior researchers and people in very senior positions are actually cornered into committing to we'll be having vaccines for everyone in 3 months, or some outlandish statement. Is there a code of conduct, or should there be a code of conduct that regulates researchers from not creating a hype? And we will be talking about hype later on, but what is your take on that?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Amir. Yes, we should be having a code of conduct, but unfortunately, we do not have anything written down right now. As I said, an NBC is an advisory body. So yes, but we have planned that from here on, we will, with our approval letters, we will draft a code of conduct for researchers, so that so attached with the approval letters, we will give a one-pager as to how you should, behave while you're doing your research. And I think it's imperative on researchers to recognize that when you do research, you start off with an area of uncertainty. So that is the premise of doing research. So if you are uncertain about something, then coming onto media does not make sense, and creating a hype, as we said. I would urge all researchers or scientists who are involved, please keep that in mind, that research starts off with uncertainty. And if something is uncertain, it should not be coming onto the media unnecessarily, unless you have grounded evidence.
Yes, and this also creates a lot of pressure on the regulatory bodies also, and it also then translates into more pressure on the researcher himself. So they will, once the study is approved by the NBC and DRAP, the media is full of news that, oh, it's been cleared, and they're recruiting student patients, and so when will we have the results, and when will we start treating, etc. So the pressure actually comes back on the researcher, who many a times is also a physician, a clinician. So this the double hat that they wear also creates problems.
There are a couple of questions. Dr. Mandal has his hand raised, so I'm just going to allow him to talk. And then there are other questions that have come in the question answer session also. So yeah.
So Dr. Mandal is from the EMRO office of the WHO. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you very much for an excellent webinar organized by our collaborating center in Karachi. My question is on the ethical review processes. How are these actually managed under very pressed time circumstances? Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so ethical review process, as I mentioned, because most of us here are of the REC are working from home. So, we communicate, once we receive the proposal, we give each of ourselves 24 hours to review proposals. And then we meet after 24 hours, we meet online, we discuss the proposal. So very well written proposals with details don't take that much of our time, and it makes our life very easy. But initially, when we received proposals from, the first few proposals, that they required a lot more effort and work. So we've managed our time effectively, and we've taken out. But the good thing is that we haven't been overwhelmed by proposals up till now. We've received about, I think, 15 proposals in the last 2 months. So we were expecting much more. So let's hope that we are able to deal with the process. Then, as we said, we go back within 48, 72 hours, we reply back to the PI. And the PI then, sends back and forth. So then we approve once we are clear about the research process. Because another step is, once they receive approval from the NBC, it also needs to go through the Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan, the Clinical Trials Committee. So that's another step.
So,
all right. So Dr. Farah Asif, the Secretary IRB at Shaukat Khanum, also has a question. Dr. Farah, I've allowed you to talk, so you can actually say something. You can ask your question directly. So if you can just unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Farah Asif. Thank you for the wonderful talk, Dr. Saima. So I'm Secretary of IRB at SKMCH NRC, Shaukat Khanum Hospital. So I believe during this pandemic, I feel the need that National Bioethics Committee or the national level REC communicates or provide guidance to the local IRBs as well on how we can have our best practices, how to adapt during these times. So this was something that we felt this is needed. From the presentation of Dr. Saima, I could relate to many of the challenges as well as many of the practices we adapted ourselves. Yes, after so many years, we needed to have a WhatsApp group for efficient communication. But still there were areas, especially we believed we were not ready or we were not trained enough to review research studies at the time of pandemic, while we do not know what is the current standard of care. And we believe that our non-scientific members, our non-doctor members, it was hard to gain their trust for those research studies. So if Dr. Saima can elaborate on these areas, it would be great. Thank you.
And Saima, do that briefly, please.
All right, thank you, Dr. Farah. I think you've raised an important point. It never, because we ourselves are struggling, so it never occurred to us that we should issue some guidance for local IRBs. And thank you for the suggestion. We will look forward into it. As to your next part, when you talked about non-scientific people so we've been lucky in the sense that the group that we have are either doctors, physicians, academicians. So we didn't have that issue, but we will take your point about providing local guidance for local IRBs.
Okay, thank you.
So we're just going to take one more question, and it's from India, I'm assuming from the name. So Dr. Saima, what additional provision, relaxation, or limitations imposed or implemented for COVID researchers than in normal situation? I observed some expedited review and use of online media. This is by Bhan. So yeah, Dr. Saima, could you raise that? And just due to the time limitation, we're just going to post questions directly.
Okay, so the question, if I understood correctly, is what are our limitations? Is that what they want to know?
No, no. They want to know what are the additional provisions, relaxations, or limitations which have been imposed specifically for COVID researchers as compared to those in normal situations.
The relaxation is that we're not waiting for IRB approvals before we submit our own approval. So we give our approval, but we request the PI to once he gets his own local IRB approval, they need to submit that to the IRB. So in the interest of time, we have relaxed that part. Whether we have given any other than that, any relaxation other than this, we haven't. I think I've answered that question.
Okay, so there's one other question by Dr. Abir. She's talking about there are many similar studies are being done in Pakistan. Is the NBC keeping a tab on those also? So there are other studies that are not coming to NBC. Apparently, that's what she's talking about. So how can the NBC actually control that?
Okay, we can't, because unless we receive a project, we can't keep a tab on a project. So depending upon if that, but any study being conducted needs to go through its local IRB. So I hope that answers your question. So we can't keep a tab if we haven't received the project per se.
Yeah, so in fact, just to add to that, if this is a clinical trial that somebody is doing, which is not going through the NBC and the DRAP, it cannot be done. So legally, it cannot be done. Clinical trials are a domain of the federal government, and these are the two organizations, the NBC and the DRAP, that actually regulate research through various types of reviews. If this is a clinical trial leading to some sort of intervention, the intervention is not possible in Pakistan to be legalized or to be given without a clinical trial that has actually been done through the review process. So if somebody is doing a clinical trial or some sort of a trial outside of this review process, then it will be coming to, it will not be of any use. In fact, it may be actually harmful also. So I think we have more questions, but Saima, I think what we will do is we'll move on to the next talk by Dr. Anant Bhan right now, and we'll take on more questions for you in the end of the session. So thank you, Saima. So Anant will now be talking about the Indian perspective. You've seen a snapshot of what's been happening in Pakistan. So he will be giving his views from the scientific as well as the ethical perspectives of COVID-related research in India. So over to you, Anant.
Thank you. I just want to confirm that you're able to see my screen.
Yes.
Yeah, it's come through. And you can see my title slide.
Yes, COVID-19 research in Indian experience.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Amir. Thank you also to all colleagues at CBEC for having me. Already I think I've learned a lot about the situation in Pakistan, and I think this is the kind of dialogue we probably need in the region to better understand how to respond from a South-to-South cooperation perspective. So specifically, I was asked to speak on the Indian experience around COVID-19 research, and I thought, I'd quickly go in by starting on the global landscape now. Mariam, I think, already highlighted a lot of these elements, but just to say that in India also we are having a lot of these kinds of research projects happening all the way from virology, stuff happening in genome, strain concerns around whether we have a different kind of strains, are certain strains, etc. Happening around diagnostics, including the possibility of developing local diagnostics, either NAT, PCR, serology, a lot of interest now in ELISA as well. There's a lot of work happening around technology development. So, because of shortage of PPE and ventilators, trying to develop low-cost versions, oximeters, looking at anosmia, accessories, other devices. A lot of work around therapeutic strategies, so management, triaging, morbidity, what kind of complications and mortality that we are seeing. I'm involved in a committee which has been also looking at repurposing of drugs. I think there is a lot of interest in that, and we've already seen some clinical trials with repurposed drugs, which I think Mariam also mentioned, and is happening in Pakistan as well. Also, the issue of toxicity and the need to conduct research. Interestingly, we are now also starting to see some work around epi-domain, public health studies. We're looking at spread and spread, though that is only picking up steam now. And I think trying to leverage also India's strength in the infotech domain, and then also work around vaccines. We have some strong manufacturing strengths in vaccines, as you all know, and that is something that is trying to be leveraged now. We also have work happening in the traditional medicine, Ayush domain. I'll speak to that a little bit later in my presentation, and some work around policy as well. So this is a slide courtesy a colleague, Santosh. I just thought it would be useful to start off with. I did a very quick search on the clinical trials registry in India. So we have a national registry. There is the global registry, which Mariam presented data of. And as of today morning, there are around 63 records for clinical trials which have been registered in the Indian registry. This is the CTRI. And these are a mix of both observational and interventional studies. Now, as you would have read about, we also have had a lockdown. This is we are currently in the third national lockdown. There is a possibility we might have a fourth lockdown from the 18th of May, and the size of the lockdown is pretty astounding, considering the size, the global lockdowns that we've seen. So this is probably the largest in terms of the population. And obviously, lockdowns like this have huge ramifications on food security, on economic security, and this has actually been a huge challenge for the sections of our population which are not so well off, which are vulnerable from a socioeconomic perspective. I think another ethical issue which we often don't talk about is because of the implications of probably the largest migration that we've seen since partition. This is probably in the range of upwards of 6 crore people who are traveling from states where they went to work in cities like Mumbai to back to their villages where they hail from. And obviously that has a public health implication, but that also has an implication in terms of the reality of life for these individuals and the huge inequities that we are seeing. Just some pictures which will show you the extent of that movement, and how that by itself is raising important equity issues, which I think as a society we need to talk about and deal with. Obviously, pandemics also have a habit of telling us the problems which we are well aware of, but then they unmask it for the rest of society. The fact that we have obviously underfunded health systems, under-resourced health systems, understaffed health systems. So our health worker population ratio to our general population is in the region probably among the lowest, both in South Asia as well as globally. And that obviously means that it's much more challenging to respond to a pandemic of this size. Now, coming more specifically to research, one of the challenges in India, and something I've worried about since the beginning of the spread of infection in India, is policy making, which seems to be sometimes based on shady or scanty evidence. And a good example is the advisories which have come out from the government side on the use of hydroxychloroquine for prophylactic purposes. Just as a reminder, this is not for treatment, this is for prophylactic purposes. And this came from the Indian Council for Medical Research, ICMR, which is a premier national research funding body. And it was advocated for what they called high-risk groups. So these are primarily healthcare workers as well as contacts of lab-confirmed COVID-19 patients. But then it raises an interesting ethical dilemma. You know, if you if you have an advisory like this, which comes from the government, does then hydroxychloroquine for prophylactic purposes become the new national standard of care for any prophylactic intervention that you might have? And does that preclude research on its usage as a prophylactic? And if so, you know, what are the elements of consent do we need to talk about? Should there be oversight for its usage when it's used in that category of patients? Only now are we starting to see some studies commencing to look at this issue, but already, you know, it's at a stage where this drug at some point of time actually was just sold out, and there was no drug available. A lot of people who were not within those risk categories started using the drug, and even you know, the drug was being dispensed to a pediatric population for which there are a lot of concerns from a safety perspective. So again, raising a lot of red flags that when you have these kinds of decisions taken, which might be based on poor quality evidence, then they can have implications from a risk and safety perspective, as well as on the kind of research that you can do. Similarly, the same advisory has been taken up by some local self-governments and municipal governments, and they've tried to implement it as some kind of prophylactic mass prophylaxis in areas where they are struggling with controlling the spread of infection. So in Mumbai, in the urban high-density populations, in slums, in areas like Dharavi, there has been a rapid spread of infection. There has been plans to roll out mass hydroxychloroquine prophylaxis in these areas and use that as one of the interventions to try to avert a rapid spread of infection. But then it raises an interesting ethical issue as well. You know, when obviously, you know, the public health measures like hygiene, physical distancing, you know, given chronic systemic neglect, are such regimens of mass prophylaxis really just a poor substitute in terms of what we've not been able to give them and what we are asking of them, and the possibility of this actually causing harm, because as I think was also pointed out earlier, there are side effects associated with hydroxychloroquine, and mass usage without actually having oversight mechanisms, pharmacovigilance, or health checkups widely available could potentially mean there would be a lot of adverse events among those who are using it. The question to ask is, you know, do these kinds of imitations of prophylaxis or usage of drugs constitute a MURI, as per the WHO definition, which Mariam was also talking about? And even if it is so, what kind of oversight from an ethics perspective should these decisions be subject to? And you know, what kind of oversight should be from the government side? What role does civil society? What role does academia? And those of us who work in the research, so what kind of questions should we be asking of these kinds of interventions? Now, as I was saying, you know, pandemics have a habit of telling us about the ugly underbelly of a lot of our systems, whether those be health systems or regulatory systems, about our deficient health systems, the leaky infrastructure that we have, the systemic neglect which has occurred, but they also tell us about the gaps in regulatory system. So a lot of, just as was described in Pakistan, there is a lot of interest in pushing research in COVID-19, in expediting research in COVID-19, both on the drug side, the vaccine sides, on diagnostics, etc. But the current oversight mechanism or the legal mechanisms, which is the Drugs Act and the rules under the Drugs Act, do not have that kind of flexibility built in. There are no legal provisions available actually which will allow you to expedite or jump in a way, you know, certain steps. So it's not very clear how is that kind of expedited mechanisms which are being implemented, under what legal framework are they being done, and if they are actually exposing us to the possibility of lackadaisical attention to safety and due process and quality science. And I think that is something from an ethics perspective we should worry about. So if talking about oversight, what kind of oversight then does exist for COVID-19 research in India? So as I was mentioning, there are the new drugs and clinical trials rules which came out last year. And these primarily are relevant for any kind of regulatory research which leads to licensing or marketing of drugs. For any other kind of research, which might be any kind of health research, whether it be public health research, whether it be academic research, whether it be social behavioral research. The applicable guidelines are the ICMR guidelines, the latest version of which is the 2017 guidelines. Now, Section 12 of these guidelines specifically deals with research during humanitarian emergencies and disaster situations. And interestingly, the reason this section was brought in was the experience with the research which happened post the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, and more recently the experiences in global health with epidemics like Ebola in Africa, where there was a recognition that you need to figure out ways where research ethics review and research ethics oversight can respond to situations of natural disaster as well as of humanitarian emergencies. And hence this whole section came through. There is a whole section on MURI in the ICMR guidelines of 2017, which talks about the need for a thorough national scientific review, oversight by a local ethics committee, only products which have a good manufacturing practice built in terms of their manufacturing, whether rescue medicines can be used, what kind of supportive treatment should be offered, etc. The importance of consent, the need for reinforcing the need for community engagement, and also fair distribution as and when there is a product which is made available through that mechanism. Now, interestingly, the ICMR has also come out as of April. These guidelines were actually released, I think, around the first week of May, but they're dated in April, which are specific for ethics committees which are reviewing biomedical and health research during the pandemic. And there is also a national ethics committee which has been specifically convened for COVID-19 research, which primarily looks at national studies under the ICMR, as well as I think any studies which are referred to them by other ethics committees. Now, coming to the kinds of research studies that we're seeing, I think there was mention made as well by Saima on the use of convalescent plasma therapy, and we're seeing that hype in India as well. There are many private hospitals which started doing these exchange therapies before they had been given permission from a research perspective. There is often, ads like this by state governments which seem to be telling the larger public that this is something which is working and we are supporting it as a government, yet not underlining that this is still basically an investigational therapy. We don't really know if it works. We don't know if the supportive therapy which patients are getting is the one which is working, and that we need to do more research in this domain. And I think that whole hype that we talked about is certainly something we are seeing in India as well. The other thing we're seeing from an ethics review perspective is the use of virtual ethics review. It's sort of become, as we are all saying, the new normal. Many ethics committees have adapted or adopted to this. There is a tech shift, which I think a lot of us were anyway expecting, given the costs of running face-to-face meetings. But rather than that being imminent, it's sort of been hastened due to COVID-19. Now, you have a lot of Zoom calls used for this, or WebEx, or Google Meets, all of these combinations of products being used. The challenges actually are more around the tech knowledge, especially among the older members of ethics committees, their comfort or discomfort with, with newer ways of doing things, questions around how is documentation to be done, how can we get signatures, etc. of members, how do you do minuting, does the chairperson, can he or she sign virtually, etc. Is electronic signatures okay? What if someone drops out? How do you ensure quorum? How do you ensure monitoring and oversight? That I think is a big question now, because in most cases, I guess ethics review members or study monitors would be considered non-essential personnel and would not be able to go into COVID-19 sections given the risks involved. So how do you actually do oversight of these kinds of studies would be a good question to ask. The other research ethics issues are, I think, around autonomy and voluntary participation. I've been part of some ethics committees where there have been lots of research studies coming in, and these are in medical schools. And is it difficult then for a patient to say no when medical care is already scarce? Because you have a lockdown in place, you have care for COVID-19 only being given in designated hospitals. So if I'm a patient and if I go in, do I really understand that I have a choice to say no for the research element, and I would still get clinical care, the best available standard of care which is existing? Also because there seems to be research happening on almost everything. If I'm just coming in and asking a question if there is prophylaxis available, there is a clinical study which will be thrown at me. If I'm asymptomatic, there is a clinical study which is designed for me. If I have mild to moderate COVID-19 symptoms, there are studies for that. If I have severe COVID-19, there are studies for that. If I am critical in an ICU or on a ventilator, there are studies for that. So for almost any kind of patient who might come in, I've seen studies designed for that in one singular institution. So it sort of begs the question, is there a choice actually for the patient to not participate in a study and know that they would be still able to get good quality care, given it's very challenging right now to get access to care. The other issue then is, what is exactly standard of care in such domains? If you're going to say that I'm going to give standard of care to my control arm in any study that I do, especially if it is, a 2-arm study or a randomized study, then what is that standard of care? And because of the nature of even our symptomatic management of COVID-19, it being so fluid, there is no one standard of care. And so do we ask for some kind of uniformity in a multi-site clinical trial, saying that at least your control arm as well as your intervention arm should be getting the standard of care, and then you try out a new intervention on top of that? And how do you decide what is acceptable when things are changing almost on a daily basis? The other question is around serious adverse events. What if those happen, given that there is a high chance of complication, especially in serious to critical cases? How do you decide on issues like compensation? Should there be insurance for these clinical trials? How do you establish causation when your ethics committees cannot meet? Who does that? And and then how do you fix compensation which should be given or should not be given, and who makes those decisions? The other thing I think I do want to point out is that in times of COVID-19, one also has seen a lot of poor quality studies, and this is basically a lot of mediocre science. One is the issue of obviously the quality of evidence, which I think Miriam started with as a first slide. Whether you're doing observational studies, are you doing interventional studies, are you doing randomized control trials, are these open label or blinded? And to what extent, and what is your sample size, etc. But one is also seeing a lot of socio-behavioral research which is happening, a lot of online research which is happening. So almost on a daily basis on many WhatsApp groups that I'm a member of, one keeps getting links to Google Forms for online surveys of various hues. They'll ask you about the impact of the lockdown, the impact of shortage of equipment, the impact on your mental health, etc. And in most cases, they've not taken this proposal through any kind of ethics review. There is usually no front-end consent which is used. It's just directly a form which you fill in, and then these individuals will either print that or take that to press and say, we found that there is a lot of mental health issues, or there is a lot of depression, without actually following due process. So the other concerns around privacy, confidentiality, the potential stigmatization, triggering for those when you're talking about psychosocial harms and asking questions about that is not really dealt with. And I think that is something which also needs to be talked about, that there is some bad science as well as ethically problematic science which is happening in the hurry to collect data in the name of the pandemic. There are also concerns around, I think, the amount of samples and data being collected right now from patients. Where are these samples being stored? Is consent taken for long-term storage? What is the rationale for long-term storage? And given shortage of PPE, in many cases we've seen health facilities where clinicians who are treating patients are not able to get quality PPE or enough PPE. Is it okay to divert PPE for research staff? For example, those who need to go in and take samples. Versus offering this limited resource that we have to frontline clinical care. So in a sense, should research be prioritized in terms of usage of PPE over frontline clinical care, if there is a dilemma around that, and what decisions need to be taken about that? Obviously, sometimes you can try to leverage the clinicians for collecting your samples, but it might not always be possible. What are the kind of risks to participants? And in this case, there are significant risks to research teams who might have to go in and interact with patients to collect data or samples, etc. The possibility, given that there is a fair amount of morbidity and mortality, that there would be some damage to trust in the clinical and public health enterprise, because if individuals think that they are being exploited or they're not getting good quality care and that they are being pushed into research studies, then that could also have a rebound negative connotation, as we've seen in the past with areas like HIV research, and we need to be careful about that. So Alex London and Jonathan Kimmelman, recently published in Science, also in an argument that just because everyone wants to do research and wants to do research fast, we should not allow for pandemic research exceptionalism. And I think that is true of our context as well, that we need to ensure that science which is being done is of high quality and it is done with due process and no shortcuts are taken. Yes, it can be expedited. Yes, it can be more efficient. that good quality science needs to happen for us to know what works, what does not work, and what then can be scaled up from a policy perspective. So again, the importance of important research, rigorous design, analytical integrity, making sure your trials are well designed and reported, as well as ensuring that only that research happens which is feasible in our own context, is something which would be important. Another area which we've worried about, and some of us got together and tried to work on this, was try to collate data on epidemiology, clinical features, lab evidence, radiological evidence, etc., around the kind of patients we're seeing in India, but also I think we drove our region as well. There's something different about how COVID-19 is manifesting. Does that explain, some of the peculiarities of maybe lower mortality in some parts? Does that explain something differently about the way that we have comorbidity in the subcontinent with higher amount of hypertension and diabetes, etc.? But to that, we need to be able to collect data from our own institutions, and that is sometimes difficult because you have the private sector, you have the public sector, and they sometimes don't speak to each other, or they might have different ways of collecting data. And again, this is not data which can be merged with each other, and that is presenting its own problems. So these are the kinds of things I think from a perspective about getting local data and acting on it, that we in the region work towards. The advantage institutions in the West have is that they will leverage the data quickly enough and use it to understand their own local trends. The one other area where I think research ethics is relevant is this whole idea around use of mechanisms for surveillance by using apps, etc. So in India, we have a flagship app which the government has released. It's called Arogya Setu, which has been sometimes in some sections made mandatory. So you cannot go and access public transport or rail travel unless you have the app installed. You might not be able to go to office post the lockdown if you don't have the app installed. And it's Bluetooth based. It's a way of telling you if you might have been or in touch with in close proximity with someone who's infected, but then raises a lot of concerns from a privacy perspective and confidentiality and data access storage usage perspective. And there have been some ethical hackers who pointed out problems with the app as well. So again, given that COVID-19 remains a stigmatizing illness, this is something we need to worry about. And this thin line of between what is research and what is surveillance, and whether we should have adequate oversight for that kind of data is also important. The other element I think is, as was mentioned, even for Pakistan, the whole element of research with non-allopathic systems of medicine. So in India, we have formal systems of medicine which are non-allopathic in nature, called Ayush. So this is Ayurveda, Unani, Siddha, and homeopathy. And in some of these cases, we've seen sections of the government which work on these departments advocating for use of therapies for either prophylaxis or treatment. But again, the evidence base is a bit unclear. Are these immunity boosters? Do they have some kind of an antiviral effect? How do we know in the absence of phase 1, phase 2 data, etc.? And what standard should apply? The whole evidence-based medicine debate. And fortunately, we're starting to see some responses from within these schools of medicine, where they're arguing that yes, there is a need to do research on these interventions because there might be some promise there, but we need to do it in a structured way so that we all understand that yes, we have enough data collected properly through rigorous science, which can tell us what works, what does not work, so that we are not basically depending on evidence which not a lot of other individuals might have confidence in. Now, at the end of my talk, I also talk about my worries around the implications of the current situation on non-COVID-19 research, because I think a lot of focus is on COVID-19 right now, of the health system, also of the research studies that we are seeing. But existing research projects or projects which are on the anvil, which are non-COVID-19, many of them have been suspended. Largely, investigators have been requested often by ethics committees to look into the welfare of research participants, if they're already on trial medication, if they're getting some standard of care medication to continue that. But there are risks involved. We also don't really know when we will be able to restart some of these research activities in a way, given the new normal, as we were talking about, where we might be required to minimize physical visits. How much of this can be translated into what virtual modes of participation and interaction and engagement, and also ensuring that in the medium to long term, there is no dearth of a focus on the need to do research in non-COVID-19 domain as well. Not everything should be consumed by the COVID-19 hype. From a research perspective that we have other problems in our subcontinent as well. Stigma is a major issue, I think, and this has become reinforced because of the way public health efforts have been implemented. So in India, we had a lot of labeling, in the name of ruthless containment. There were, for example, stamping done of individuals who were in quarantine, were identified and were outside the home. This home is under in home are under quarantine and you should stay away for the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And there's also some element of naming and shaming which is happening, including of healthcare workers who got infected, while refusing to acknowledge that it might be have been a function of poor quality personal protective equipment. And what implication does this have for health and well-being and for their potential participation in research and public health control efforts is something we need to talk about. So where should we move then, and especially from a regional perspective, from a subcontinent perspective, what is the role for regional cooperation in research in this domain? Times like this, I think, reinforce that diseases will seldom respect national borders. It's also important for us to talk about how we can cooperate, from a South perspective on regional security needs, because the only security we talk about is the military kind or the arms kind. But there are lessons, I think, from other illnesses and control efforts like in polio, where I think there is a lot to learn from each other. And how can we cooperate in research and understanding clinical correlates, as I talked about, and how do we reduce our dependence on R&D from abroad, and and leverage our own strengths around manufacturing, around patient base, and do more research of local relevance, which can lead to production of interventions, which does not require us to, for example, license in drugs from other MNCs. And I think we've seen examples of that with COVID-19 as well. Gilead, I think, is having a field day with agreements with multiple companies, both in India, I think also in Pakistan. I've seen some news reports. So that's how the MNCs, I think, are standing majorly from this. But this is something which is a reminder for us to build our own strengths around the R&D domain, as well as making sure that we focus on health security. So I'll stop there, but hope to figure some for this. Thank you.
All right, so there are a couple of questions that we have. Dr. Mandil, if you can ask your question, please.
Yes, can you hear me now, please?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. Given that India is one of the most populous nations on earth, I have two questions for you. And in comparison to China, obviously the pandemic has been much less affecting India. So what are the epidemiologic measures or testing strategies from which lessons could be learned for other nations? And secondly, how could the federal or provincial authorities control lockdown measures on mass scale? Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. So a couple of things. I think, from an epi perspective, what's interesting in India is that we have a much more discrete national spread. I think China had the advantage of a lot of localization of illnesses around Wuhan. And so their response actually was to basically shut that region off and, bring in reinforcements of health systems and healthcare workers, which we can't do in India because we are having almost a spread of infection in multiple regions. And we are struggling in some regions to respond because of shortage of not just resources, but also staff. But what is being tried out, I think, is ramping up of testing, because we've had challenges with getting testing that tests are available and are turned around fast enough in parts of India. The other plans are actually to do more serosurveillance, also to do more community-based random testing to find out actually what is the extent of spread of infection. Because right now the only data we have is based on testing, and usually testing is done for primarily individuals who are symptomatic, healthcare workers, and sometimes contacts of those infected. But it seems to be the case that there is probably a spread of infection, at least localized in many communities, and we will not know till we do those kinds of community-based studies. So I think that's the next approach which there is a lot of thinking about. But again, the shortage is one of test kits, of local innovation, of tests which are reliable. There was a lot of imports of test kits, especially antibody test kits, but they basically had they turned out to be a failure because they had extremely low sensitivity and specificity. So we want to make sure that we have validated test kits available, and that I think is also something there is a lot of focus on for developing those kinds of test kits now.
So there's a question from Melba Kitindi from Nairobi, which is a point that you've also raised, Anant, in your own talk regarding the recruitment of subjects and how to eliminate various extra influences and keep it voluntary in a lockdown situation in which there is no therapy available, and whatever is available is in this research study. Either take that or take nothing, and they call nothing as standard of care, which is also, as you pointed out, in Sonoma. So in this situation, you actually raised this also as a question, but Melba wants an answer. So how do you address the concerns of recruitment in this situation?
Right.
So I think so. There's probably a strong role for national ethics committees in this domain, as well as local ethics committees, obviously. And I think that is one of ethics oversight for these kinds of studies. So you need to make sure that your consenting processes, your consent document are of good quality and provide enough detail. There is also an important role for community engagement at this time. I think not just for the public health response, but also for making people understand that there is no panacea out there. We need to do good quality research to know what will work and what will not work, and that one way of doing that is by doing quality research. But that research is not at the cost of access to healthcare, and that you have a right to participate. And many people have volunteered, for example, to donate plasma once they have recovered. But again, they should not feel that they are actually helping cure someone, for example. They need to understand that you're contributing to a research study. But having good quality consenting mechanisms, ensuring that your teams on the ground are trained, that they need to reinforce this, and maybe having some public education around the importance of understanding research versus therapy would probably be what would be important. And I think it's extremely important for investigators to buy into that, because in the rush to conduct more and more studies, because you have WHO chasing you, wanting to do solidarity trial in your institution because you have cases coming in, you have a lot of pharma companies who are interested. You might get caught in the in the lure of all of those studies and say, okay, I can be a star investigator by doing all of this, and you could certainly do that, but hopefully not at the cost of ethics or ethical conduct.
So in fact, that was my next question was regarding the community involvement in research, and we always emphasize that community involvement should be there. Now, in this fast-forward research, in which there is so much hype already created in media and social media and all of that, getting valid community involvement in that short span of time becomes another huge challenge, which is why the research review has to be actually very, very good. The informed consent process has to be very, very good, and that's what we will actually be looking at in our review process also, as to when you're recruiting patients, do they actually know? In fact, we've actually sent back in many informed consent documents which were selling the research as actually therapy. This is it. This is an excellent study which has proven benefits in China, and now we're doing it on you. So this is kind of misleading documents that actually we've been facing. Okay, so there is another question. Swaliha from...
Oh, okay, so there's this question by Muhammad Ahmed. In times of lockdown, monitoring audit by sponsored and inspection by regulators suffers. This will have an impact on concurrent assessment, quality and regulatory authority. What alternative mechanisms could be thought about on this?
Yeah, absolutely true. I mean, so, already in India, the national lockdown means there are no mechanisms of, for example, intercity travel. Trains are suspended, flights are suspended. So typically monitors, study monitors who come in from either the sponsor side or the regulator side cannot access many clinical trial sites. And if you are lucky, you might have someone available locally who can come in, but even, a lot of people obviously are fearful about the risks involved of travel, even within the city, etc. So I think a lot of that is now shifting slowly to virtual modes. And, in some of the studies I'm involved in, we are having interactions with study monitors online. A lot of this data is stored in online folders. obviously with passwords, etc., and made available to them. There is a lot of video interaction because many patients are not accessing or study participants are not accessing clinical trial sites right now. The interaction with the participants is lesser, but this is also an opportunity for a lot of research teams to look at their own existing data, to prepare for a post-lockdown scenario where they can restart operations. And I think a lot of research groups are focused on that. But again, most of this is trial and error, and people are learning on the go because these are unprecedented situations. No one has seen this kind of situation before, or at least such a protracted delay in being able to run operations from even a clinical trial perspective.
Back with more questions at the after this final talk, and the final talk is with Dr. Natasha Alvarez, who will be talking about the hope and hype around the COVID research. So Natasha, over to you. We've made quite a good groundwork for you to launch into your talk.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody who's joined the webinar. I am hopefully going to try and sort of summarize and add a few more points to all the three talks that you've already heard. And before I do that, I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see if we can do this. Right here. Okay.
Yes.
Too many windows open right now. Hang on. Slideshow.
Yes, we can see your.
Okay, great. Got it. The slides are up. Fantastic. Okay. Can I turn my video off so that the slides can be a little bigger? Is that okay with everybody?
This is fine. I think you can
have see the slides?
Yeah, we can see the slides and you together.
Okay, all right, super. All right, great. Okay, so what I'm going to try and do over the next 20 minutes, and I promise Ahmed it is going to be 20 minutes, is to give, start off with again, something very similar to what Mariam's already spoken about, but with a slightly different take on it in terms of trying to understand our unique circumstances at the moment. So where, how important it is to have a good study design, how much strength and validity it adds to the results, and what's happening right now in the pandemic setting. A little bit about the research process life cycle and what's happening in terms of the COVID-19 research life cycle. And again, something that almost everybody's already sort of touched upon is the hype that some of these studies have created. And I'm just going to again very quickly go through a few examples of the of where particular interventions, particular therapies have been highlighted as as miracle cures and as game changers. But what the consequence of that hype has been, I think it's very important to try and address that and look at that. And then to try and really come up with some strategies about how we can try and move forward and how we can try and learn from whatever's happened in the last 3 months to try and strengthen our research process. So let me start off with showing you all what a regular research process looks like. And you start off with a question, a problem, you write a proposal about it, the proposal gets reviewed by various regulatory bodies. You start the project, and following that, you basically, you acquire samples, you collect your data, you process that data, you analyze it, you interpret it, hopefully you publish it. And that, in a sense, is validated because of peer review. And that sets up ideas and the basis for actually doing another study. And this is where, this is why it's cyclic. And this is where when you come up with an idea or some therapy that or a new drug or a novel drug, it goes through various cycles of preclinical testing. So when it goes through preclinical testing, you go through all of these stages. When it goes to clinical testing, again, you go through all of these stages. And where's have I clicked on the other? Okay, And it takes years. I mean, we're looking at, easily 4 to 5 years for this cycle to be complete, and for us to have some, good results in terms of how. And I'm not talking about actually from designing the drug to actually getting through clinical trials and getting approval to actually use that as standard treatment. That takes up to 10 to 15 years. So what's happening with COVID, where we've obviously got a problem and we've got multiple questions. We've still got the regulatory approvals that are required. We're designing the study, we're testing and treating at the same time, and we're looking at and monitoring outcomes. The results of these outcomes are actually being pre-printed on preprint servers. And they're also eventually published through this fast-track publishing mechanism that's being established by various journals. And this is literally taking months, if not. So we've got a complete contrast between a regular research process, and we're squeezing that into years of work into a few months. And as Mariam's already highlighted, that's extremely challenging. So we rely on a real body of evidence, a strong body of evidence, in order to establish standard clinical treatment guidelines. And again, Mariam already showed you this at the beginning of her presentation, which is the golden sort of standard pyramid of evidence. And right at the top are meta-analyses of all these randomized controlled trials. But what have we so far managed to do with COVID treatment evidence? It's a little bit, it doesn't really look like that perfect triangle, does it? It's actually, right now we've got a lot of anecdotal evidence. We've got a tremendous number of case reports that have been published. We've got observational studies that are being published, and very, very few randomized controlled trials. So we are very, very far off from actually beginning to sort of even put together any kind of standard clinical treatment guidelines. And again, I think it's really important to point out that a lot of the preclinical studies and the proof of principle studies for especially the repurposed drugs were all done on closely related viruses like SARS and MERS. So there is a lot of, I mean, we're still not sure what's going on. There's so much happening out there. We're getting publication of so many studies where people are saying that yes, there's modest demonstration of efficacy. There is moderate demonstration of efficacy. We think this is hopeful. We it has its limitations, but there we do anticipate that it could be effective, and therefore additional trials are recommended. And this is something common at the end of all of these publications. So this is a slide which sort of I kind of put together this morning, and it's really the news feed from my that's on my phone every morning, and there's no shortage of headlines related to COVID treatment. And I think really this has been a sort of a key aspect of the pandemic since the beginning, is that really there's no shortage of headlines in the newspaper on a daily basis, and these headlines are changing. So right at the top, I put these here deliberately because they're actually related to Pakistan. One headline was "World-class breakthrough, Pakistani scientist finds treatment for coronavirus." I wish this was true. I really do, but unfortunately, it's not true. Yes, there is some interesting role of these antibodies that this team has isolated from this university, but we're very far off from showing that this is actually a treatment for coronavirus. And again, here on the right-hand side, doctors conduct successful plasma therapy trial on Hyderabad coronavirus patient. After the treatment of one single patient with plasma therapy, we've seen endless headlines in the newspaper and on social media and on the television about how successful this trial has been, based on one patient having been treated. So again, we're really misinterpreting a lot of what's going on. but again, there's a common theme. You're looking for hope. You're looking for new treatments. Is it working? Is it not working? Something that was very interesting in this of yesterday's New York Times. One of the headlines was, "Can team science yield a COVID-19 treatment?" So now we're all on different teams all of a sudden, according to the New York Times. One that I really like is this: Trump stops hyping hydroxychloroquine after study shows no benefit. This was actually taken from last week, so this is not this morning's headline. So this really is contributing to to the hype around various treatments. And I think I really wanted to put this one up and share it with everybody, which was a tweet that Donald Trump sent out on the 21st of March, in which he says hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin taken together have a real chance to be one of the biggest game changers in the history of medicine. Obviously, he hasn't really read the history of medicine. So the FDA has moved mountains. Thank you, FDA. Hopefully they will both I'm sure he's referring to hydroxy works better with azithromycin, and he's quoted the article that was actually published by the French scientist, which really started off this entire hype about the utility of hydroxychloroquine for COVID treatment. So there are a number of factors contributing to this hype. Obviously there's an immense pressure. Thousands of people are dying. We still don't have an effective way to treat these people. There's a desperate race to find treatment. And this is, all of this, all of this is within the context of, it's not just research being done by researchers and physicians. You've got politicians getting involved. You've got prime ministers giving opinions, presidents giving opinions based on whatever they're being fed about these various treatments. And obviously there's a huge economical impact, has already been highlighted by Anant, not only in Pakistan, but also in India. One other thing is that, there's this moral responsibility the doctors, healthcare workers and scientists have. They're being hailed as messiahs. I mean, one of the tunes that I'm hearing every evening on a local news channel is, "Hame tumse pyar hai, tum masiha ho is qaum ke." So translated into English, that means you're saviors, you're messiahs of our country, and we love you. So I think again, this is we're expecting miracles from doctors and healthcare workers and scientists. So a lot of the misinformation is being kind of, accelerated and fueled by the fact that a lot of the data and studies are actually available as preprint versions on these servers that are freely accessible to anybody. It's an open access forum, and really the intention is to try and make this information available as quickly as possible, but also that it gets out there to not just scientists and researchers. It gets out there to journalists, to politicians, to public health officials, to economists. And so you're getting a lot of reviews of these articles by all these different disciplines. And that has a positive and a negative aspect to it too. But, essentially what we've sort of really seen, unfortunately, is that there's been more of a negative than a positive impact of these preprint servers, in that it's really led to a lot of misinterpretation of research findings by journalists, politicians, and public health officials. And it's spreading more uncertainty, fear, and confusion across the globe, and it's happening within minutes. So, Mariam and Anant have all referred, both of them have referred to the three key sort of players in the COVID race right now for trying to identify an effective treatment. That's chloroquine, remdesivir, and plasma therapy. And what I've done here is I've just trying to sort of, put a very quick table together just to give you an overview. And Mariam already has gone through some of the specific limitations of a lot of the studies that have been published related to these treatments. But again, I think the concern is that, they are case series or case reports. And the other issue is that, although randomized controlled trials have been done, there have been serious limitations with those. Sorry, disappeared for a second. There are some limitations of those trials based on the fact that they have a small sample size. There's a significant amount of bias. Eventually, they showed no significant benefit, and there were some adverse effects reported. So it's really important to recognize that, the hype has created a lot of consequences. And I think the first and foremost really is that, especially if we do not have very clear-cut results from a particular treatment, and we're using it in further, small case studies, are we not exposing severely ill patients to additional harm? Because these treatments do have very serious side effects. The other concern has been that, because of, especially with the hype about the prophylactic use of hydroxychloroquine, it led to a lot of self-prescription, and it actually led to people sort of, taking it and using it without any medical supervision, and that created a lot of serious concerns and issues. Anecdotes have fueled demand in the sense that as soon as this information went out on social media, in the press, not only did it lead to stockpiling by individuals, not only in Pakistan. I mean, I think within days you couldn't find chloroquine in any pharmacy, but it also led to stockpiling by other countries. So the US, in fact, has stockpiled 25 million doses of hydroxychloroquine. And that's led to a huge shortage for, obviously, diseases like malaria that the drug is actually intended for. As well as all of this, there is, again, a huge concern about the therapeutic misconception that a lot of these headlines and misinterpreted results create among patients and their families. And the therapeutic misconception, not only creates a misunderstanding about whether they're being treated or whether they're in a trial, but it also, again, adds to difficulty in recruiting patients for other treatments and other trials. And they found this, there have been a number of reports recently where patients have said that they want to continue their treatment with hydroxychloroquine, and that's compromised the the validity and integrity of trials, because they're finding it difficult to recruit patients, and the patients they are recruiting are sort of preferentially wanting to be continued on hydroxychloroquine or go into a trial which is already using hydroxychloroquine. It derails search for other useful treatment options, and I think, again, this is a huge concern amongst the research community, and something that Saima has already spoken about is that claiming very early success and significant outcomes, when really, in reality, we really need to wait a little bit more before we actually make such claims. And I think we probably have a little bit of a discussion later on about how we can try and sort of, in a way, control this, or whether the moral responsibility is on physicians and researchers to ensure that they do not make such claims. But having already told you about the fact that there's already this moral responsibility on them to be these messiahs, these superheroes, I don't know how easy this is going to be. Another real area of concern is that the hype creates and influences policy. There are a lot of national treatment guidelines that have implemented hydroxychloroquine as part of their standard of care. In fact, new investments for production of drugs and vaccines by pharma companies. I mean, in the headlines 2 days ago, we saw that Gilead, the pharmaceutical company that's producing remdesivir, has just signed fantastic contracts in Japan and in Pakistan for the production of remdesivir. So without really knowing whether or not this is really going to work here, I think, we're sort of investing enormous amount of resources and hope in, and is that too soon? I don't know. We do have some positive things to look forward to. There are now initiation of global randomized controlled trials designed to be informative and more robust. And these are actually taking on the sort of form of these platform trials. And two examples are the WHO Solidarity Trial and the REMAP CAP. So I think this is, again, out of just the, in fact, the REMAP CAP was something that was developed for pandemic influenza, and it's just been this sort of silent back burner project that's been running, and sort of basically has been now reharnessed for working on COVID-19. And then again, a recent study on triple combination. It was a phase 2 trial, a triple combination on the treatment using interferon beta 1b, lopinavir and ritonavir and ribavirin. There were some limitations to this trial, but it was an open label, which it wasn't a randomized. It was randomized, but it was open label and it wasn't blinded. So there was some criticism of that, and it was actually also stopped earlier because of the recruitment issues. It was actually conducted in China, but by the time by this time, I think the cases had started to go down, and they weren't able to recruit the initial number of patients that they had planned to, in order for that study to be more powerful and to show a significant difference. But what they were able to demonstrate was that this combination did have a dramatic impact on the viral load, in that the patients were PCR negative by day 7, as opposed to day 12 in the different treatment arm. So vaccines, again, are a new hope. We're not sure when they're going to be available, or for that fact, where they'll be tested. So this really nice article that Anant also actually put up in one of his slides by London and Kimmelman, which is against pandemic research exceptionalism, published in Science in the first week of May. They came up with a very interesting set of criteria for approval of studies. So they are saying that it's really critical that that any kind of study done right now in this pandemic, it should be important. So trials should address key evidence gaps, and these should be judged from reviews of existing evidence in trials. So that you need to be very up to date with what's happening and what's being published. There should be a rigorous design, so trials should be designed to detect clinically meaningful effects, so that both positive and negative results serve the informational needs of clinicians and health systems. They need to be designed so that, according to a pre-specified protocol, so they need to have analytical integrity. The reporting should be done completely and promptly and consistently with pre-specified analyses. And I think there's been some concern about this, not only for some of the hydroxychloroquine trials, where they've noted that the trial registered on the clinicaltrials.gov server, the trial design mentioned there was very different to the trial design that was actually in the preprint version. So that's raised some concerns about how the results are being reported. But another issue is that the remdesivir trial by the NIH in United States, they again, we only know that there's been some significant improvement in, and this drug has had some significant impact on COVID patients because of a press conference. So no one's actually seen the data, no one's actually reviewed it, and no one's been able to sort of analyze it in that sense. So again, there is some concern there about how you report trial data. And again, feasibility. So studies must have a credible prospect of reaching their recruitment target and being completed within a time frame where the evidence is still actionable. So, and I think that this is absolutely important in terms of actually allocating resources, and especially in a low resource setting where we perhaps don't have the capacity, the funds, or the time to sort of, to explore too many things. We really need to be focusing on things that can be completed. So how do we do this? How do we try and, ensure that these criteria are met? Who is responsible for trying to ensure that these criteria are met? Well, it's our good old guardians of research. And so I think there's an enormous pressure right now and onus on IRBs and I think Saima has highlighted it fantastically, and then she's shared the experience of the REC of the National Bioethics Committee in Pakistan, and gone through the challenges and concerns that they've already faced. And I think my concern here, and she's addressed it very well, is that do IRBs have enough information right now? And this is all changing constantly. So if they are responsible for evaluating risk and benefit, how are they keeping on top of this information? How are they, ensuring that they're informed of the latest trial and information from publications? Because this information is changing. It's changing with every new publication. And I think she's also already alluded to the fact that fast tracking will require several revisions and submissions, and this is again very taxing on IRBs. But something else that came up in a webinar yesterday that I actually sort of joined in, they were talking about the fact that this, the responsibility of reviewing proposals, especially because of the huge public health impact. This is not just, so there are two aspects here. You're not just, the IRB is no longer just needed to ensure safety and risk and benefit for the individual, but also for the community and the public. So it's because of the situation that we're in. So there was a very interesting discussion yesterday that maybe because of that the approvals process should shift to national ethics committees, and that they should take on the key role here and disseminate out trials to various institutions, and let the institutional IRBs then take over from that point onwards. Again, peer review journals also really are very important in ensuring that we've got good credible research that's published. But because of the rapid turnaround required by many journals, a lot of journals have started to expand their reviewer pool, and I think that's been very challenging for them too. But I think the other concern has been the fact that you've got these preprint servers now, and although they are enabling input from lots of other disciplines, because this pandemic isn't just about virology or medicines or epidemiology. It's about a lot more than that. It's economies, it's social sciences. So if we just reserve the review process for researchers and scientists, we may not get a wholesome 360-degree review of that publication or its implications. But I don't know how. I don't think that that's a reason for actually not ensuring that it gets published in a peer-reviewed journal. And I think that there is still concern in a lot of the scientific community that we hope that journals haven't lowered their bar because of the urgent need to have information, whatever that information is. So if we're going to move in the right direction, we need to have more robustly designed studies. And how are we going to do that? I mean, do we have the time to build the capacity to train our researchers to be able to not only design but conduct these studies? I think there is also a need to address this gap in understanding the difference between treating and testing drugs in a pandemic situation, because I think this is really what a lot of physicians are misunderstanding in Pakistan especially. And I think that this misunderstanding is then sort of really again sort of creating a therapeutic misconception amongst patients too. Maybe one way that we can address the capacity issue and the robustly designed studies issue is to consolidate our resources and form a research consortium. Now, Anant has already talked about maybe doing, collaborative research, and I think it's really important if we start thinking about regional, national consortiums, bringing expertise and resources and ideas together. We need a mechanism to be able to evaluate projects that can be done quickly without compromising the quality. And I think the NBC will play a very pivotal role, and it already is playing a very pivotal role in this. And I think, they've already talked about co-opting more experts, but I'm just wondering, do we have enough experts to actually look at, as we get more and more studies, will we have enough people to review the study designs and the science behind some of these trials? Something that I thought about during the webinar yesterday was an international scoring or grading system for therapeutics being investigated, and whether this can be updated as evidence is provided, through publications on a if not a daily or a weekly basis. Because this will really help, I think, IRBs also to sort of really have a better idea of and be updated about information regarding different therapies. I think, again, Ahmed already touched on this about community engagement. I think, again, something that will definitely help is transparency and what we're doing and how we're doing it. And how open we're being about what we're doing. I think there's been a real lack of community engagement in terms of health information, in terms of safety information and precautions and things. I think that's been very good. But in terms of what are we actually doing about this, and what are some of the steps that what is the research that's being done to try and understand this disease? I don't think we've been very good at communicating that to the public. And I think we need to document all of this, and we need to learn from our challenges, so that, God forbid, we have another pandemic in the years to come, that we've actually already established some of these systems and made them stronger, so that we just need to sort of, bring them in to the forefront and sort of start using them. So I'm going to end on this very, this paragraph from the same publication, Against Pandemic Research and Exceptionalism, because really it sort of highlights everything that we've been talking about today. The moral mission of research remains the same: to reduce uncertainty and enable caregivers, health systems, and policymakers to better address individual and public health, rather than generating permission to carry out low-quality investigations. The urgency and scarcity of pandemics heighten the responsibility of key actors in the research enterprise to coordinate their activities to uphold the standards necessary to advance this mission. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
20
Natasha.
minutes, Ahmed? Was that
fantastic. Thank you very much, Natasha, for a very good talk. You can stop sharing your slide now.
Yeah, and we have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Dr. Shazia Fatma has asked a question, which is, getting an international RCTs or coordinated research project is becoming like getting a medal. But do you think real people at Frontline are involved in such projects? In my opinion, they don't have time and energy to sit back and analyze data. How do we ensure that actual person who's actually doing the real work or doing the treatment is involved in such research projects?
Okay, so I think, I don't think we're expecting frontline workers who are taking care of patients to, to come up with a research proposal, or to sort of even try and invest the time. Obviously, they don't have the time to try and do this. I mean, this is why we need a, we need a support system. And I think, if international trials are going to be done, and we're sort of, I think embarking on one of them with the WHO, the Solidarity trial in Pakistan, and a number of centers are involved in that. But look, you can't spread this out into every single institution. That's not the point of research. The point of it, because it will become extremely difficult to do. You have to have the infrastructure to support this. And if you're a frontline worker working in one hospital without any research office or research coordinators or additional capacity to help you conduct this trial, you won't be able to do it. And the idea is not for everybody to do it. The idea is for some centers to do it, who have the capacity to do it, and to do it well, and to be able to collect the data and be able to help us develop some more evidence and find a way in which we can then help patients who are being physicians who are treating on the front line. I hope that answers the question.
There's one more from Dr. Mozzam. Dr. Natasha, would you not consider what is being touted about vaccinations as the final cure or solution also hype in view of what we know or what we do not know so far about COVID virus?
Absolutely, Dr. Mozzam. The issue is that we still don't have enough studies on the immune response to this virus. We know that there's a strong antibody response. We know that some of these antibodies are neutralizing, but right now, without the preliminary data in terms of knowing what sort of response a vaccine is going to generate, and how long that immune response is going to last, and whether or not it's going to be protective. I mean, we've got a long way to go in terms of. So you're absolutely right. This idea that people are saying, okay, we're going to get a vaccine within 6 months, and then we're going to be able to vaccinate people, and people are going to go back to their normal lives. I think that's really, really extremely unfair to be saying this, because we still, and it's not to sort of try and create a depression amongst people that we're not going to get out of this, but it's to be realistic and honest that it's going to take us some time to get out of this.
This is a question for all of the panelists. Anybody who wants to respond is more than welcome to respond. So we've mentioned, you guys have mentioned more than once the Muri trial. So could you, perhaps Mariam could do that, or Natasha or Anant, whoever. What is a Muri trial? And you've also talked about randomized controlled trials as the best sort of gold standard in which you could assess things. Can a Muri trial actually take place in an RCT format in such situations as a pandemic?
Well, I think if Mariam wants to tell everybody what a Muri is, but I'd also answer the second part of that. No, it can't, because these are individual patients who are actually treated on an individual basis. There was a study, remdesivir publication, that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, again, I think last week, where it was an international study. And again, what they've done is they've presented data on the emergency use of remdesivir. And I think that it was really, it was blown apart and because of the fact that, you had a number of patients, but, you had 22 from the US, you had 6 from France, you had 5 in Germany. So, you had, not only did you have difference in standard of care across these countries, so therefore making some kind of comparative or evaluation would be extremely difficult. So making any kind of statistical or meaningful evaluation across the board amongst these patients would be very, very difficult. So, that's my take on it. But maybe Mariam wants to add to that.
So for all panelists,
Mariam's on. Mariam, do you want to add to the Muri trials? Well, trials the name, but the Muri data.
So yeah, so as the name suggests, this is essentially a monitored emergency use of unregistered and investigational interventions. So this the Muri protocol is usually this was developed by WHO, and it is a means to provide an emergency treatment to people in an epidemic situation when no proven effective intervention exists, which is also the case for COVID. But there are some other conditions also. So a Muri protocol is usually adopted when it is not possible to initiate clinical studies immediately, and you do have data that provides some preliminary support to that particular intervention's efficacy and safety. And most importantly, the relevant countries' authorities, as well as an appropriately qualified ethics committee, approve such use. And it is extremely important that wherever that drug is being used, they have adequate resources to ensure that any risks because of that proposed intervention, which is nonetheless an investigational drug, can be minimized. You need the patient's consent as well, and you need to monitor the use of that intervention, document those results, and share them in a timely manner with a wider, medical community. The aim of MURI is not to replace RCTs. RCTs remain the standard way to generate conclusive evidence.
And isn't it that the MURI has to transition to an RCT eventually?
Yes.
Yeah, isn't that one of the requirements? Yeah.
Yes. So that's, I mean, there are several conditions that you need to meet for MURI as well. And not every regulatory authority or country has actually adopted all those protocols. There are many countries, perhaps even in Pakistan, where off-label use is being adopted without the relevant regulatory protections in place.
It's very useful, both of you. Now, okay, so coming back now to going to India, so the plasma convalescent trials experimentation is also obviously going on in India also. What is the framework or format in which it is being done, performed in India at the moment? Anant?
Sure. So I think what's happening is that while there were some private hospitals which started doing the studies in advance of getting the requisite regulatory approvals, there is a requirement to go through the Drug Controller's Office, which is the Drug Regulatory Office, also called as CDESCO in India, take their permission and then conduct studies. So actually what's happening now is that the Indian Council of Medical Research has gotten approval from the Drug Controller General's Office in India to conduct a multi-site clinical trial for plasma therapy. And that is happening at multiple trial sites. They're recruiting those sites now, and that hopefully will give us some definitive data with enough numbers about whether there is any promise in plasma therapy or not. The problem, I think, is with sample sizes. If you have only 2 or 3 patients, and then you come up with some kind of press releases which seem to indicate that it works based on that limited data, then obviously that is problematic. And that's the kind of media hype that we are seeing. What we need is actually these larger studies with enough numbers which can tell us that whether there is some promise to plasma therapy, and if how should that be used, and in what conditions, and with what care, and for what category of patients, because again, whether it should be used for a mild, moderate, severe, or even critically ill. So we'll have to look at that. But I think that data will only come through in due time, because the numbers right now who have gotten plasma therapy is fairly low. And one of the challenges many of us have discussed within groups which have been looking at the therapies right now or potential deployment is that plasma therapy is not necessarily very scalable. So I think one of the challenges, unlike vaccines or even repurposed drugs, is going to be, even if plasma therapy works, it will only be available to a small section of the population who might need it because of the costs involved, because of the resources involved. And again, it might be therapy which maybe only the rich or those who have access to high quality public health care might receive, but it will not be something which can be scaled up to the entire population.
There's one more question for you, Dr. Anant. That's from Dr. Salahuddin Khan. He says, I have a question about the overall IRB process in India. We see that principal investigator of a research is sitting in one country and gets research approved in India, and many of the times these researches involve humans. It raises questions on the review process of research by the IRB. The fear is that there will be more of such approvals in pandemic situations. Would you please elaborate the overall IRB process in India, and what can you recommend for such cases when the PI is not in the country?
Anything of this, any of this kind of research typically is international collaborative health research and needs to go through a screening committee which is established by the Health Ministry in India. It's called the Health Ministry Screening Committee, or HMSC. And the secretariat of that is housed at the Indian Council of Medical Research. So only when you get approval from that committee are you allowed to do this kind of international collaborative research. And then again, you need to take permissions from the ethics committees or IRBs at your local institutional level, as well as at the parent institution where the overall principal investigator might be if he or she is abroad. And typically you will need some kind of a site principal investigator in India who's accountable to local authorities. And because of prior experiences with exploitative research, which is or parachute research, as we often say, where people come and collect data and leave, and build their careers on that without any way contributing to local capacity building or the local health system. I think this has become something which is now very strictly implemented, or expected at least. I think there are probably still some projects which fall through the cracks, but I think for most prospective centers, this is a routine that they need to follow. And the screening committee essentially does not function as an ethics committee. It's more to make sure that, to look into the areas that you're working, ensuring that they are in concordance with national health priorities, that there is no exploitative elements. You're not collecting data or samples and taking it away without requisite permissions or material transfer agreements, etc. So I think that's a safeguard which has been built in, but then again, it needs to be reinforced by ethics review at the local level as well. And that is a requirement, and I don't think you can skip that in any way, even for COVID-19, it would still be required.
Dr. Shazia Fatma. There's a comment by Dr. Shazia Fatma from Islamabad that shouldn't the National Bioethics Committee in Pakistan ban the researchers giving interviews, updates on social media or media claiming success of projects? This should be allowed only after the completion of data, after approval of the National Committee, etc. So, Saima, maybe you can address this question.
Okay, thank you for the question. So let me remind you that the National Bioethics Committee is an advisory body, and we have raised this issue within our own meeting. We would appreciate people from other walks of life if you could write to us, because remember, we also need to build a case for this. And because we've communicated our concerns to the advisor to the Prime Minister about this as well. So we would appreciate, yes, we do agree there should be some sort of mechanism. The NBC, as I told you, we're not regulatory in nature, but we can bring this up. So if you have any concerns regarding conduct of trials or regarding researchers coming on media, please do write to us so that once we have it in document form, we can take it up on a more formal level so that some action can be taken.
Dr. Ahmed, can I just add to that?
Yes, please go ahead.
The thing is that we might be able to do something about researchers and doctors and scientists in Pakistan, but what about globally? Because this isn't just a phenomena that's happening here. We've got, experts coming on American TV and British TV and in all these other places. So I think it's something that's a international issue and not just here in Pakistan. And I'm not sure how we would be able to address that, but that's just my comment on that.
Shaista Khan from Karachi, from AKU Karachi, has actually commented on this area also. She says that to minimize the hype that is being generated by speakers and non-experts all through TV shows and the media, there should be a central cell to control any information based on research that should be shared only by experts. So there should be a regulation for this kind. Nothing is more harmful, she says, than miscommunication over or under in projects that are actually underway still, because the vast majority of projects actually will not lead to something which is tangible or useful. So that's a very important point. And again, Saima, perhaps through the NBC, this can be raised and taken to DRAP also and other forums also. I was wondering, is similar kind of a hype a problem in India also, Anant?
Yes, there is. I think the hype is, we have probably an equivalent or maybe more number of media channels. And I think there is, for once, there is a lot of attention to health, but it's also a lot of, what we call an infodemic. So I think one of the areas where a lot of us have been trying to step in is to address the infodemic. So while I think it's important to prevent the the fact that researchers should not be going on live TV or radio shows and hyping therapies or interventions which we don't have the evidence base for. There is also an important role researchers, health professionals, public health folks, epidemiologists need to play in actually communicating the right information and in contextualizing the pandemic and the requirement to do public health measures, to do proper research. I think that kind of information is sorely needed, because otherwise you will have politicians, policymakers, religious leaders, coming in and stepping in and talking about the pandemic when they have no clue about it. So I would rather have the experts come in and be realistic about the pandemic and its response and provide the right information, because that is really important at this point of time.
Okay, great. So I think we are coming to the, before we end, we have one more question that we have from Nairobi. So we've had a very diverse group of attendees. We've had, although this is focusing on India and Pakistan, we have people from Nairobi, some of our students attending. We have people, of course, we have Dr. Ahmed Mandel from Cairo, Enro. We have Dr. Hasan Shamsi from Tehran. So it's a pretty diverse, and several people from India whom I don't know. So it's been a diverse group of attendees. So there's another question that has come up from Nairobi by Dr. John Viru. Swalia, you have that question?
So given that sharing of data across borders, for example, genomic information, will be key in fighting the pandemic, how do we ensure that this is done in an ethical but yet an urgent manner? And I think any of the panelists can answer this question.
I think Dr. Natasha could also comment on this, but I already know that many researchers across the globe are actually collaborating to create data sharing platforms for this very purpose. And this includes data and sample sharing platforms. And it is not something that is unique to COVID. This is something that is often considered for other rare diseases also, because conducting research into diseases where samples and data is precious is often hampered by the fact that you don't have enough information or samples available to test on. So for such research, often you have platforms and consortia where people have, memorandum of understanding in place to ensure how to, safely and ethically share data amongst each other for research purpose. And the same is being explored for COVID right now as well. So yes, that can be one way.
Yeah, I think, Mariam, you're right. There are actually, it's been a bit slow trying to put these consortiums together. And I think right now, we don't have one in Pakistan, but I think that's, or a regional one as far as I'm aware of. But the, I think that would be a really good way forward to try and at least share resources and expertise. The biorepositories, the AKU, Aga Khan has actually set one up and is actually adding samples to the COVID biorepository. But whether or not what their plans are in terms of access for other investigators and other researchers, I'm not so sure. But I do believe that we're a bit slow in putting these consortiums together. But you're right. I mean, I think when they are put together, and as far as, again, the NBC, and I'm sure Saima would comment on this, that any international research projects, especially when it involves the transfer of data or biospecimens, has to get approval from the NBC.
I think you've made a very important point in the end. The South-South collaboration is also extremely important, and as we were trying to build information banks, also not only data banks, and sharing information like we're doing right now between India and Pakistan. We hope to do so similar exercise with Iran at some point, and with other parts of the world where we have similar concerns and similar challenges, etc. So I would like to end this particular session by thanking all the four panelists, Mariam, from Lahore, Saima from Islamabad, Natasha from Lahore, and Anant from somewhere in India. I'm not sure where you are at the moment, Anant. Are you in Pune or are you in Bangalore?
I'm actually in Bhopal right now, Central India.
Bhopal, okay. So with Zoom, I mean, the huge disadvantages of lockdown and being sequestered in your own spaces. But one of the things that has come across is that we can actually now meet easily without issue of visas and flights and money and all of that, and still share information, knowledge, and work together also. So I think this is an important initiative, and we'll like to keep this going forward with partners in India and partners elsewhere, etc., with our students in Africa. So on not only a topic of research around COVID, but also many other social aspects, cultural aspects, clinical aspects. There are several aspects, and we plan to have several of these tackled in the near future. So thank you again for the panelists and for the many participants who attended the seminar. Thanks a lot again, and Khuda Hafiz and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.